7-year-old Leo Martinez never imagined his life would change in an instant. But when a wealthy stranger recognizes his mother's name, the truth unravels, secrets of lost love, betrayal, and a legacy he never knew was his. But not everyone wants him to claim it. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sun beat down on Fifth Avenue as 7-year-old Leo Martinez stood at his usual corner. His worn-out shoes had holes in them, and his t-shirt was 2 sizes too big. Every day for the past year since his mother's death, he'd been here, watching fancy cars drive by and rich people hurry past him without a glance. "Please, just some change for food," he would say quietly, but most people acted like they couldn't hear him. Some would look at him with disgust, while others would whisper to their friends about those street kids. Leo's stomach growled. He hadn't eaten since yesterday, when the nice lady from the bakery had given him a day-old bagel. He thought about his mother, Maria, and how she used to make him scrambled eggs every morning before she got sick. The memories made his eyes water, but he quickly wiped them away. Street kids couldn't show weakness. "Boy, move along." A security guard from the nearby luxury store waved his hand at Leo. "You're scaring away the customers." Leo was about to leave when a black Mercedes pulled up to the curb. The window rolled down slowly, revealing a man in his 50s wearing an expensive suit. Leo had seen many rich men before, but this one was different. He didn't look angry or disgusted. Instead, he stared at Leo with an intensity that made the boy nervous. "What's your name?" the man asked. His voice was deep but not unkind. Leo hesitated. His mother had always warned him about talking to strangers, but something about this man seemed familiar, like a face from a dream he couldn't quite remember. "Leo," he answered softly. "Leo Martinez." The man's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, and his face turned slightly pale. "Martinez," he repeated, as if the name meant something important. "Was your mother's name Maria?" Leo's heart started beating faster. How did this stranger know his mother's name? "Yes," he said, taking a small step back. "How do you know that?" The man reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an old photograph. It was worn around the edges, like it had been handled many times. "Come closer," he said. "I want to show you something." Against his better judgment, Leo moved toward the car. The man held out the photograph, and Leo's breath caught in his throat. It was his mother, much younger, holding a baby. She was smiling that bright smile he remembered so well. "That's my mom," Leo whispered, touching the photograph with trembling fingers. "And that baby, is that me?" The man nodded slowly. "My name is Alexander Whitmore," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I knew your mother a long time ago. In fact," he paused, taking a deep breath, "I loved her." Leo's mind was spinning. He'd never known his father. His mother would only say that he'd gone away before Leo was born. Could this man be— "Get in the car, Leo," Alexander said gently. "We have a lot to talk about." Leo looked around the busy street. Every instinct told him not to trust a stranger, but his heart was pulling him toward this man who had his mother's photograph. Who knew her name? Who looked at him like he was searching for something? I don't know," Leo said, but his hand was already reaching for the car door. "I promise you'll be safe," Alexander said, "and I'll explain everything. About your mother, about me, about why I'm here now." Just then, the security guard started walking toward them again. "Hey, I told you to move along." Leo made his decision. He pulled open the heavy car door and slipped inside. The leather seat was soft, and the car smelled like expensive cologne. As Alexander drove away from the curb, Leo held the photograph of his mother tightly. "Are you—" Leo started to ask, his voice shaking. "Are you my father?" Alexander's eyes met Leo's in the rearview mirror. They were the same deep brown as Leo's own. "Yes," he said quietly. "I am. And I've been looking for you for a very long time." The car turned onto Park Avenue, leaving behind the corner where Leo had stood for so many days. Neither of them knew it yet, but this moment would change both their lives, forever. For Leo, it was the end of his life on the streets. For Alexander, it was the beginning of a chance to right the biggest mistake of his life. but finding each other was just the start. Ahead of them lay a journey filled with challenges, secrets, and the hard work of turning two strangers into a family. The truth about why Alexander had left and what had really happened to Maria would test them both in ways they couldn't imagine. As the car drove through the city, Leo kept looking at the photograph. His mother's smile seemed to be telling him something. Maybe, just maybe, this was what she had always wanted, for her son to find his way home. The iron gates of the Whitmore mansion swung open as Alexander's Mercedes pulled into the circular driveway. Leo pressed his face against the window, his eyes wide at the sight of the huge house with its white columns and perfect gardens. It was bigger than any building he'd ever seen up close. "This is where you live?" Leo asked in amazement. Alexander nodded, but there was tension in his jaw. "Yes, but before we go in, there's something you should know." He turned off the engine and turned to face Leo. "I have a wife, Victoria, and two daughters, Ashley and Madison. They don't know about you." Leo's heart sank a little. Of course there would be other people, other children who belonged here, who hadn't been begging on the streets. "Maybe I should go," Leo whispered, suddenly feeling very small in his dirty clothes. Alexander reached back and put his hand on Leo's shoulder. "No, you're my son, and it's time for me to do what I should have done years ago. It won't be easy, but I promise you're not leaving. Not ever again." Before they could say more, the front door opened. A tall woman with perfectly styled blonde hair appeared, wearing an expression that made Leo want to hide. "Alexander, what is this?" Victoria Whitmore's voice was sharp as she walked toward the car. "Why weren't you at the board meeting? And who is this?" She paused, looking at Leo. With distaste, "My child?" Alexander got out of the car and opened Leo's door. "Victoria, we need to talk inside. I will not have some street urchin in my house." Victoria's voice rose. "What will the neighbors think?" "He's my son." The words hung in the air like thunder before a storm. Victoria's face went white, then red. "What did you just say?" "Perhaps we should continue this inside," Alexander said firmly, putting his hand on Leo's shoulder. Leo could feel the man's hand trembling slightly. As they walked toward the house, two teenage girls appeared in the doorway. Ashley and Madison Whitmore, both blonde like their mother, stared at Leo with open curiosity and confusion. "Dad, what's going on?" Ashley, the older one, asked. "Girls, go to your rooms," Victoria snapped. "Now!" Inside, the house was like nothing Leo had ever seen. Crystal chandeliers hung from high ceilings, and thick carpets covered marble floors. But he barely had time to look around before Victoria rounded on Alexander in the grand foyer. "Have you lost your mind?" she hissed. "After 20 years of marriage, you bring home some... His name is Leo," Alexander cut in. "And he's my son from before we met. His mother was Maria Martinez." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "That waitress? The one you told me was nothing? A brief fling before you took over the company?" Leo felt anger bubble up inside him. "My mother was not nothing," he burst out, surprising everyone, including himself. "She was everything to me." Victoria turned her cold gaze on him. "Well, isn't this convenient? Your mother dies and suddenly you appear looking for a piece of the Whitmore fortune?" "Victoria," Alexander's voice boomed through the foyer. "That's enough. Leo didn't come looking for me. I found him, and I'm the one who left them, not the other way around. I'm the one who chose money and power over them, and I've regretted it every day since." Just then, Mrs. Chen, the housekeeper who had worked for the Whitmores for decades, appeared from the kitchen. She took one look at the scene before her and immediately understood something big was happening. "Mr. Whitmore," she said calmly, "perhaps the young man would like to get cleaned up and have something to eat." Alexander looked grateful for the interruption. "Yes, thank you, Mrs. Chen. Leo, go with Mrs. Chen. She'll take care of you while I talk to Victoria." Leo hesitated, not wanting to leave Alexander. What if this was all a dream? What if he left and they sent him away? "It's okay," Alexander assured him, seeming to read his thoughts. "I'll come find you soon. We have a lifetime of catching up to do." Mrs. Chen gently led Leo toward the kitchen, but he could still hear Victoria's angry voice. "If you think I'm going to accept this, you're deeply mistaken. What about our daughters? What about our reputation?" In the warm kitchen, Mrs. Chen sat Leo at a big wooden table and placed a sandwich and a glass of milk in front of him. "Don't you worry about Mrs. Whitmore," she said kindly. "She'll come around or she won't. Either way, you're Mr. Whitmore's son, and that means you belong here." Leo took a bite of the sandwich, the first real food he'd had in days. As he could hear raised voices from the other room. Victoria was crying now, and Alexander's voice was getting louder. Somewhere upstairs, he could hear his half-sisters talking in excited whispers. Mrs. Chen patted his hand. "Big changes take time," she said wisely. "But I've worked for Mr. Whitmore for 30 years, and I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looked at you just now. Like he found something precious he thought was lost forever." After Leo finished eating, Mrs. Chen showed him to a guest room bigger than any apartment he'd ever lived in. There was a huge bed with soft pillows, and through another door, a bathroom with a shower that had hot water. "Take your time getting cleaned up," Mrs. Chen said. "I'll find you some clean clothes. They might be a bit big. They're from when Miss Ashley was younger, but they'll do for now." As Leo stood under the hot water, watching years of street dirt wash away, he couldn't stop thinking about his mother. Was she watching from heaven? Had she known this would happen? Had she forgiven Alexander for leaving them? He put on the clean clothes Mrs. Chen brought and sat on the edge of the huge bed, holding the photograph Alexander had given him. In it, his mother looked so young and happy, with no idea how hard her life would become. "I miss you, Mom," he whispered to the photograph. "I wish you were here." A soft knock at the door made him look up. It was Alexander. "Can I come in?" his father asked. Leo nodded, and Alexander sat beside him on the bed, looking at the photograph too. "Your mother was the bravest person I ever knew," Alexander said quietly, "and I was a coward. But I promise you, Leo, that ends today. No matter what happens, no matter who objects, you're my son, and this is your home now." Outside the room, Victoria was on the phone with her lawyer, and the girls were still whispering. And Mrs. Chen was planning tomorrow's meals with an extra place at the table. The peaceful life of the Whitmore mansion had been turned upside down. But in that quiet room, a father and son sat together, looking at a photograph of a woman they had both loved, beginning the long journey of becoming a family. Victoria Whitmore sat in her private study, gripping her phone tightly as she spoke to Edwin Pierce, the family lawyer who had served the Whitmores for 3 generations. "There must be something we can do," she insisted. "We can't just let this street child inherit half of everything we've built." "Mrs. Whitmore," Edwin's voice was cautious, "if the boy is indeed Alexander's son, and DNA tests prove it, he has legal rights. The question is, what do you know about his mother's death?" Victoria's perfectly manicured nails drummed on her desk. "Only what Alexander told me. She died of pneumonia last year. Apparently, she never even told him she was sick." She paused. "Why?" "Because something doesn't add up. I've been looking into Maria Martinez's hospital records. She had health insurance through her job at the diner. She should have received proper medical care. But according to these records, she never showed up for her final treatments." Victoria leaned forward. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that there might be more to this story, and if we want to protect your daughter's inheritance, we need to find out what really happened to Maria Martinez." Meanwhile, upstairs, in his new room, Leo was trying to get used to wearing the school uniform Mrs. Chen had helped him put on. The navy blazer felt stiff, and the tie was too tight, but Alexander had insisted he start school right away at Madison Prep, where his sisters went. "You look very handsome," Mrs. Chen said, adjusting his collar. "Just like your father when he was young." A knock at the door made them both turn. It was Madison, the younger of Leo's half-sisters, standing there awkwardly with her backpack. "Mom said we have to leave for school," she said, then added quickly, "Do you want to ride with us? Dad had to go to the office early." Leo looked uncertainly at Mrs. Chen, who gave him an encouraging nod. "Thank you," he said to Madison. The car ride to school was tense. Victoria sat in the front seat, ignoring Leo completely, while typing furiously on her phone. Ashley stared out the window, but Madison kept sneaking glances at Leo and offering small smiles. At school, Leo felt everyone's eyes on him. Word had spread quickly about the Whitmores' new addition. Some kids whispered and pointed, while others just stared openly. "Look, it's the charity case," he heard one boy say to his friends. "Betty doesn't even know how to read." Leo's face burned, but he remembered what his mother always told him. "Hold your head high, mi amor. Your worth isn't in their words." To everyone's surprise, it was Ashley who spoke up. "Hey, Trevor," she called out to the boy who'd made the comment. "At least he got in here on his own merits, not because his daddy had to buy a new library wing." Trevor turned red and slunk away. Ashley turned to Leo. "Don't let them bother you. They're just jealous because you're the biggest story to hit Madison Prep since Jennifer Wilson's mom ran off with her tennis instructor." Leo couldn't help but smile. It was the first time Ashley had spoken directly to him. Back at the mansion, Victoria was meeting with a private investigator in her study. "I want to know everything," she instructed. "Every place Maria Martinez worked, lived, visited. Every person she talked to in the year before she died. Something happened, and I want to know what it was." The investigator nodded, making notes. "And if I find something sensitive," Victoria's eyes hardened, "then you bring it directly to me. Not to Alexander, not to anyone else, to me." What Victoria didn't know was that Mrs. Chen was passing by the study at that moment, and the door hadn't been completely closed. The housekeeper's eyes narrowed as she heard Victoria's plans. She'd known Maria Martinez all those years ago when the young waitress had stolen Alexander's heart. And she knew something else, something she'd kept secret for 20 years. That afternoon, while Leo was still at school, Mrs. Chen knocked on Alexander's office door at the mansion. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, her usually calm voice trembling slightly. "There's something you need to know about Maria, about why she really never told you about Leo." Alexander looked up from his work, seeing the serious expression on his housekeeper's face. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Chen closed the door behind her. 20 years ago, when Maria tried to tell you she was pregnant, she came here. But you were in a board meeting. Mrs. Whitmore, she wasn't Mrs. Whitmore then, just your girlfriend, she was here. She told Maria you didn't want to see her. She said you'd paid her to go away and never contact you again. Alexander's face went pale. "Theodisa, what, I didn't know." "Maria believed it. She thought you had rejected her and your child. That's why she never tried to contact you again. And last year, when she got sick..." Mrs. Chen paused. "Someone from your company's legal department approached her. They offered to pay for her treatment, but only if she signed papers promising never to reveal Leo's connection to you." Alexander stood up so quickly his chair fell backward. Who did this?" "I don't know," Mrs. Chen admitted, "but Mrs. Whitmore might. She's meeting with a private investigator right now, trying to dig up dirt on Maria. She's afraid Leo will inherit." "Inherit?" Alexander's voice was dangerous now. "This isn't about inheritance, this is about my son. My son who grew up on the streets because..." He couldn't finish the sentence. Just then, they heard cars pulling up outside. School was over, and Leo was back. Through the window, Alexander watched as his son got out of the car with Madison, both of them laughing about something. Despite everything he'd been through, Leo could still laugh. "Thank you, Mrs. Chen," Alexander said quietly, "for telling me the truth. Now I know what I have to do." As Mrs. Chen left the office, she saw Victoria coming down the hallway, looking pleased about something. The two women exchanged glances, one determined to protect the innocent, the other determined to protect her position. The truth about Maria's death was still buried, waiting to be uncovered. But the first cracks in the carefully constructed walls of lies were starting to show. And in the middle of it all was a 7-year-old boy who just wanted to belong somewhere. That evening, as Leo sat doing his homework at the kitchen table, he had no idea that both his past and his future were about to collide in ways that would change everyone's lives forever. Alexander Whitmore paced in his study, the weight of Mrs. Chen's revelations heavy on his shoulders. The morning sun cast long shadows across the room as he waited for Victoria to return from her tennis lesson. On his desk lay a stack of papers, hospital records, legal documents, and a letter he'd found in his company's confidential files. That changed everything. The sound of the front door opening made him stop pacing. Victoria's heels clicked on the marble floor, getting closer to his study. We need to talk, Alexander said as she appeared in the doorway, still in her tennis whites. Victoria's smile faded when she saw his expression. What's wrong, darling? Sit down. His voice was cold in a way she'd never heard before. I know what you did, 20 years ago and last year, to Maria, to Leo, to my son. The color drained from Victoria's face, but she quickly recovered. I don't know what you're talking about. Alexander picked up the letter from his desk. This is a copy of an agreement sent to Maria Martinez last year when she was dying, offering to pay for her medical treatment in exchange for her silence. About Leo. It's signed by Edwin Pierce, but the instructions came from you. I was protecting our family. Victoria stood up, her composure cracking. That woman was going to ruin everything we built. That woman, Alexander's voice shook with anger, was dying. My son was about to become an orphan. And you knew all along he was out there. In the hallway, unknown to both of them, Leo stood frozen. He'd come home early from school with a stomachache, and Mrs. Chen had sent him upstairs to rest, but the raised voices had drawn him to the study. She never took the money, Victoria said defensively. She was too proud, said she'd rather die than take anything from us. Well, she got her wish, didn't she? The sound of something falling made them both turn. Leo stood in the doorway, his backpack at his feet, tears streaming down his face. Leo, Alexander started, but the boy turned and ran. Leo, wait! Alexander moved to follow him, but Victoria grabbed his arm. Let him go, she said. This is for the best. He doesn't belong here, Alexander. He never did. Alexander jerked his arm away from her. No, Victoria. You're the one who doesn't belong here anymore. I want you out of this house by tonight. You can't be serious. Victoria laughed, but there was fear in her eyes. What about our daughters? What about our life together? Our life together was built on lies. You kept my son from me. You let his mother die alone. Everything we have is tainted by what you did. Upstairs, Leo had locked himself in his room. Through his tears, he could hear footsteps coming up the stairs. There was a gentle knock at his door. Go away, he shouted. Leo, it's Ashley and Madison. His half-sister's voices surprised him. Please let us in. We heard everything. After a moment's hesitation, Leo opened the door. Ashley immediately hugged him, something she'd never done before. We're so sorry, she said. We had no idea what Mom did. Madison was crying too. We want you to stay, Leo. You're our brother. Meanwhile, Mrs. Chen was in the kitchen, making Leo's favorite hot chocolate, when Victoria stormed in. You! Victoria pointed an accusing finger. You told him, didn't you? Mrs. Chen calmly continued stirring the hot chocolate. I told the truth. Mrs. Whitmore, something this house hasn't seen in a very long time. Well, I hope you're happy, Victoria spat. You've ruined everything. No, Mrs. Whitmore, you did that all by yourself. Upstairs, Alexander finally convinced Leo to open the door for him. He found his son sitting between his half-sisters, all three of them supporting each other in their own way. Leo, Alexander said, kneeling in front of him, I know nothing I say can make up for what happened to your mother, but I promise you from this moment on everything changes. No more secrets, no more lies. Did she... Leo's voice was barely a whisper. Did she really refuse the money? Even though she was sick? Alexander nodded, his eyes filling with tears. Your mother was the strongest person I ever knew, and the most principled. She wouldn't let anyone buy her silence, not even to save her own life. That's why she didn't tell me she was sick, Leo realized. She didn't want me to know how bad it was, because she knew I'd beg her to take the money. Ashley squeezed Leo's hand. She sounds amazing. She was, Leo said proudly. She worked 3 jobs sometimes, but she never complained. She always said we had everything we needed, because we had each other. A commotion downstairs interrupted them. Victoria was leaving, dragging her designer suitcases behind her. This isn't over, Alexander, they heard her shout. You'll regret choosing that woman's son over me. No, Victoria, Alexander's voice was firm. My only regret is not finding him sooner. As Victoria's car roared down the driveway, the mansion felt different, lighter somehow, as if a dark cloud had finally lifted. Mrs. Chen appeared with a tray of hot chocolate and cookies. I think, she said wisely, this family could use something sweet. As they sat together, Alexander, Leo, Ashley, Madison, and Mrs. Chen, they weren't just sharing hot chocolate. They were sharing the first moments of their new life as a real family. But outside the mansion's gates, Victoria was already on the phone with Edwin Pierce. "Find me everything you can about Maria Martinez's last days," she ordered. "There has to be something we can use. This isn't over, not by a long shot." What none of them knew was that Maria had left one final secret, a letter written on her deathbed that would change everything again. And it was about to find its way into their lives. The next morning, Sister Margaret stood in her small office at St. Mary's Hospital, holding an envelope that had been waiting for this moment for over a year. She remembered the day Maria Martinez had given it to her just hours before she passed away. "When the time is right," Maria had whispered, her voice weak but determined. "When Leo finds his father, only then." Now, watching the morning news about Alexander Whitmore's family scandal splashed across the TV screen, Sister Margaret knew the time had come. At the Whitmore mansion, the family was trying to find their new normal. Alexander had taken time off work to be with his children. They sat around the breakfast table, Leo still amazed by the mountain of pancakes Mrs. Chen had made, Ashley texting her friends about the drama, and Madison making plans for Leo's room redecoration. "We should paint it blue," Madison suggested. Leo said that's his favorite color. The doorbell interrupted their breakfast. It was Sister Margaret, her kind face serious as she introduced herself. "I was with your mother," she said to Leo. "In her final days," she turned to Alexander, "and I believe you need to hear what Maria wanted to say to both of you." In Alexander's study, Sister Margaret handed Leo the envelope. His hands trembled as he opened it, recognizing his mother's handwriting. "Would you like me to read it?" Alexander offered gently. Leo nodded, passing him the letter. Alexander cleared his throat and began to read. "My dearest Leo, if you're reading this, then you found your father, and I pray he's the man I always knew he could be. There are things you both need to know. Alexander, I never told you about. Leo, because I believed you had rejected us. I learned years later that wasn't true, but by then, pride and fear kept me silent. That was my mistake, and Leo paid the price. But there's more. Last year, when I got sick, a woman came to see me, Victoria Whitmore. She offered money for my treatment in exchange for my silence. But she wasn't alone. With her was Thomas Whitmore, Alexander's younger brother. They told me if I ever revealed Leo's existence, Thomas would lose everything. You see, Alexander, your brother knew about Leo all along. He was the one who intercepted my messages 20 years ago, who made sure you never knew about your son. He was afraid that with an heir, you would never step aside and let him take over the company. I'm telling you this now because Thomas is still waiting, still planning. He thinks with me gone, all evidence of his deception died too. Leo, mi amor, forgive me for not fighting harder. Know that everything I did for love. Alexander, our son has your strength and my heart. Take care of him, and watch out for your brother. With love always, Maria. The room was silent when Alexander finished reading. Leo was crying quietly, and even Sister Margaret wiped away a tear. Thomas, Alexander said, his voice dangerous. My own brother? Just then his phone rang. It was his secretary, panic in her voice. Mr. Whitmore, you need to see this. Thomas has called an emergency board meeting. He's trying to take control of the company. Alexander's hands clenched into fists. He won't get away with this. At that moment in the Whitmore Industries boardroom, Thomas Whitmore stood before the board members, his expression grave. My brother has lost his way, he was saying, bringing in an illegitimate child, throwing away his marriage. The company needs stable leadership, and Victoria agrees with me. Victoria stepped forward, a stack of documents in her hands. I have proof that Alexander is unfit to lead this company. But what Thomas and Victoria didn't know was that they weren't the only ones with documents. In her small apartment, Mrs. Chen was opening a dusty box she'd kept for 20 years. Inside were letters, photographs, and a security camera tape from the day Maria had come to tell Alexander about his child. Back at the mansion, Leo tugged on Alexander's sleeve. What are we going to do? Alexander knelt down to his son's level. We're going to fight, Leo, together. Your mother was the bravest person I ever knew. Now it's our turn to be brave. Ashley and Madison appeared in the doorway. We want to help too, Ashley said firmly. Nobody messes with our brother. Sister. Margaret smiled, watching this family unite. Maria would be proud, she said softly. This is what she always wanted. All of you together fighting for what's right. But across town, Thomas and Victoria were putting their plan into motion. Once we take control of the company, Thomas said, we'll make sure that boy never sees a penny of the Whitmore fortune. And Alexander? Victoria asked. Thomas's smile was cold. My brother made his choice. Now he'll have to live with the consequences. Little did they know, Maria's letter wasn't the only surprise waiting to be revealed. In her final days, she had prepared one last gift for her son, evidence that would shake the Whitmore empire to its foundations. As the sun set over the mansion, Alexander held his son close. Your mother protected you all your life, he said. Now it's my turn. Leo looked up at his father, seeing the determination in his eyes. For the first time since his mother died, he felt truly safe. But the storm was just beginning, and tomorrow would bring battles none of them were prepared for. The morning of the emergency board meeting dawned grey and stormy. Alexander straightened his tie in the mirror, while Leo watched from the doorway of the master bedroom. I don't want you to go, Leo said quietly. Uncle Thomas is a bad man. What if he hurts you? Alexander turned to his son, remembering how much the boy had already lost. Nothing is going to happen to me, Leo, I promise. Mrs. Chen will stay with you and your sisters while I'm gone. Downstairs, Mrs. Chen was on the phone, speaking in hushed tones. Yes, meet me at the Whitmore building in 1 hour. Bring everything. She hung up just as Ashley and Madison came into the kitchen. We heard you, Ashley said. You're going to help our dad, aren't you? Mrs. Chen smiled mysteriously. Let's just say I've been waiting 20 years to set things right. At Whitmore Industries, the board members were gathering in the grand conference room on the top floor. Thomas Whitmore stood at the window, Victoria at his side, both looking pleased with themselves. Everything is in place, Thomas said. The board has no choice but to remove him as CEO. The scandal alone, don't get cocky, Victoria warned. My husband isn't stupid. He wouldn't come here without a plan. As if on cue, Alexander walked into the room. But he wasn't alone. Behind him was Sarah Martinez, Leo's elderly grandmother, who had been Maria's only family. What is she doing here? Thomas demanded, his face going pale. Mrs. Martinez has some interesting stories to tell, Alexander said calmly. About the night Maria tried to tell me about Leo. About how you, dear brother, paid her to keep quiet about seeing Maria being turned away. The board members murmured among themselves. Thomas laughed nervously. This is ridiculous. You're going to believe some old woman's stories? Not just stories, came a voice from the doorway. Mrs. Chen walked in, carrying a box. I keep everything, Mr. Thomas, everything, including the security tapes from 20 years ago. The ones showing you intercepting Maria, paying her off, threatening her. Victoria stepped forward. This is all very touching, but it doesn't change. The fact that Alexander has brought scandal to this company, his illegitimate son, is my grandson. A new voice interrupted. Everyone turned to see Eleanor Whitmore, Alexander and Thomas's mother, walking into the room with Leo by her side. Grandma, Thomas stuttered. What are you doing here? Enough! Eleanor's voice cracked like a whip. I've watched this family tear itself apart for too long. Thomas, I know what you did. I know about the money you embezzled from the company to pay for your gambling debts. Did you really think I wouldn't find out? The boardroom erupted in chaos. Victoria tried to slip out, but Mrs. Chen blocked her path. Going somewhere? I think the police would like to talk to you about interfering with Maria's medical care. Back at the mansion, Ashley and Madison were pacing anxiously when the front door opened. Leo ran in, followed by Alexander, Eleanor, and Mrs. Chen. What happened? Both girls asked at once. Thomas has been suspended pending an investigation, Alexander announced. And Victoria is going to have to answer some difficult questions from the authorities. But what about us? Madison asked worriedly. What about our mom? Alexander gathered all 3 children in his arms. Your mother made some terrible choices, but she's still your mother. When all this is sorted out, if you want to see her, we'll make that happen." Eleanor watched her son with pride. "You know," she said to Mrs. Chen, "I always knew Maria's boy would find his way home. I just didn't know he'd save this family in the process." That evening, as a storm raged outside, the family gathered in the living room. Leo sat between his sisters on the couch, while Alexander told them stories about Maria from their younger days. "She used to sing while she worked at the diner," he remembered fondly. "She had the most beautiful voice." "I remember," Leo said softly. "She used to sing me to sleep every night, even when she was really tired from working. She was the love of my life," Alexander admitted, "and I let fear and ambition take me away from her. But she gave me the greatest gift. She gave me you, Leo, and now somehow we're all together." Ashley squeezed Leo's hand. "We're going to be okay, aren't we?" "More than okay," Alexander promised. "We're going to be a real family." But across town, in a luxury hotel suite, Thomas Whitmore was not ready to give up. He stared at an old photograph, one that even Maria hadn't known about. One that could destroy everything Alexander had built. "You think you've won, brother?" he whispered to himself. "This is just the beginning." And in her holding cell, Victoria was making a call to an old friend, someone who knew an even darker secret about the Whitmore family's past. Someone who could change everything. The storm outside grew stronger, but inside the mansion, Leo felt safe for the first time since losing his mother. He didn't know that the biggest challenges were still to come, that the next few days would test their newfound family bonds in ways none of them could imagine. As Mrs. Chen served hot chocolate to everyone, she caught Eleanor's eye. They both knew this calm was just the eye of the storm, but this time Leo wouldn't face it alone. He had a family now, one that would fight for him with everything they had. "To family," Alexander raised his mug. "To family," they all echoed, and somewhere Leo was sure his mother was smiling. Thomas Whitmore sat in his hotel room, staring at the old photograph in his hands. The edges were worn, but the image was clear. Maria standing outside the Whitmore mansion, not 7 years ago when Leo was born, but 25 years ago when she was just 16. And next to her stood Eleanor Whitmore, looking exactly like the mother Thomas remembered from his childhood. "You weren't just some waitress Alexander fell in love with, were you, Maria?" Thomas muttered. "You were already part of our lives, and Mother has been lying all these years." His phone buzzed. A text from Victoria. "Meet me at the old summer house. Bringing someone you need to meet." Across town at the Whitmore mansion, Leo was helping Mrs. Chen in the kitchen when Eleanor walked in. She stopped short, seeing the boy rolling cookie dough just like Maria used to do. "You look so much like your mother," Eleanor said softly, her voice catching. Leo smiled, but Mrs. Chen noticed how Eleanor's hands were shaking. "Mrs. Whitmore," the housekeeper said carefully, "perhaps we should talk about the past. The real past." Eleanor's face went pale. "Not now, Rose," she whispered, using Mrs. Chen's first name, something she never did. But Leo had caught the exchange. "What about the past? What aren't you telling me about my mum?" Before Eleanor could answer, Alexander walked in looking worried. "The police just called. Victoria's been released on bail and she's disappeared." "That's not our only problem," Mrs. Chen said, making a decision. "There's something you all need to know. About Maria. About why she really came to work at the mansion all those years ago." Eleanor gripped the kitchen counter. "Rose, please." "No more secrets," Mrs. Chen said firmly. Maria was Eleanor's daughter. The kitchen fell silent. Leo's cookie dough fell to the floor. Alexander stared at his mother in shock. "What?" he whispered. Eleanor sank into a chair, tears rolling down her face. "I was so young when I had her. Your father, your real father, not the man who raised you, he was already married. The scandal would have destroyed both families, so I gave her up for adoption. My mother," Leo said slowly, "was your daughter, which means she was Alexander's half-sister," Mrs. Chen finished quietly. "And you, Leo, are not just Alexander's son, you're also his nephew." Alexander stumbled backward, his world spinning. "All those years ago when I fell in love with Maria, you knew? You knew she was my sister?" "I didn't," Eleanor cried. "Not at first. By the time I realized who she was, you were already in love. I tried to keep you apart without telling you the truth. That's why I pushed you toward Victoria. That's..." Why I made sure you took that business trip to Europe when Maria was trying to tell you about the baby. Oh God, Alexander felt sick. Does Thomas know? He does now, came a voice from the doorway. Thomas stood there holding the old photograph. I found this in Mother's study, along with Maria's original birth certificate. Ashley and Madison, who had been listening from the hallway, came running in. Dad? Ashley's voice shook. What does this mean? Alexander looked at his daughters, then at Leo, his son, his nephew, the child of a love that should never have been. It means we're all victims of lies. Lies that have destroyed lives for generations. It means nothing, Leo suddenly shouted, surprising everyone. My mother loved me. She loved you, Dad. Alexander, whatever the truth is about how we're related, that love was real. Mrs. Chen put her arm around Leo. He's right. Maria never knew the truth either. She died believing her love story with Alexander was fate, not tragedy. How touching, Victoria's voice cut through the kitchen. She stood in the back doorway with an elderly man none of them recognized. But wait until the press hears about the great Whitmore family secret, about how Alexander Whitmore fell in love with his own sister. Victoria, don't, Eleanor pleaded. Oh, but I must, Victoria smiled coldly. Unless, of course, Alexander is willing to sign over his shares in the company to protect his his nephew, from scandal. The elderly man stepped forward. I'm James Martinez, Maria's adoptive father, and I have proof of everything. Eleanor paid my late wife and me a fortune to adopt Maria. We kept our end of the bargain for 40 years. But now, well, the truth should be worth even more, shouldn't it? Leo stared at the man who was technically his grandfather. You knew, all this time, even when Mum was dying? James had the grace to look ashamed. Maria never knew she was adopted. We thought it was better that way. Alexander moved to stand between his family and the blackmailers. You can't hurt us with the truth anymore. We're stronger together than any secret. Are you sure about that? Victoria pulled out her phone. The press is waiting for my call. One word from me, and the whole world will know about the Whitmore family's greatest scandal. Your company will be ruined. Your children will be outcasts. Is that what you want? Eleanor stood up straighter, finding her strength. No more running, no more lies. She turned to Thomas. Your father, your real father, he loved you, raised you as his own, even knowing the truth. He chose love over blood, just like Maria did, just like Alexander is doing now. The truth will destroy us, Thomas argued. No, Leo said firmly. The lies destroyed us. The truth can set us free, Victoria laughed. Such drama, but let's be practical. Alexander, you have 1 hour to sign over your shares, or tomorrow's headlines will be very interesting indeed. As Victoria and James left, the family looked at each other. Decades of secrets had finally come to light, but instead of tearing them apart, Leo could feel something else happening. They were coming together, stronger than ever. What are we going to do? Madison asked, holding Leo's hand. Alexander looked at his mother, his brother, his children, this complicated, imperfect, beautiful family. We're going to tell our story, our way, no more hiding, no more shame. And in that moment, standing in the kitchen where so many secrets had finally been revealed, they all knew nothing would ever be the same. But maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what they needed. The morning headlines screamed across every newspaper in the city. Whitmore family scandal, CEO's secret love, child revealed as product of forbidden love. Victoria had made good on her threat, but she hadn't counted on one thing. The Whitmores were done running from the truth. Alexander sat in his home office watching the media circus unfold on multiple TV screens. Reporters camped outside the mansion gates, desperate for a comment. His phone wouldn't stop ringing, but his focus was on Leo, who sat quietly beside him, clutching his mother's photograph. Are you okay? Alexander asked softly. Did you ever wonder, Leo said, why Mum and I looked so much like you, even before you knew who she really was? Alexander's heart ached. I thought it was fate bringing us together. Now I know it was blood. A knock at the door interrupted them. Ashley and Madison entered, followed by Eleanor and Mrs. Chen. Thomas, surprisingly, was with them. "The board is demanding an emergency meeting," Thomas said, his voice lacking its usual arrogance. They want both of us to step down." "Let them demand," Eleanor said firmly. "It's time we told the whole story. My story." Mrs. Chen nodded. "I've contacted every major news outlet. They're gathering at the Whitmore building in an hour. It's time for the truth, all of it." Victoria's face appeared on one of the TV screens, giving an interview outside her lawyer's office. "The Whitmore empire is built on lies," she was saying, trying to look sympathetic. "As Alexander's wife, I felt it was my duty to expose the truth." "Former wife," Madison muttered. "And she's just angry because her plan backfired." An hour later, the Whitmore building's conference room was packed with reporters. Cameras flashed as Eleanor Whitmore took the podium, her family standing united behind her. 43 years ago, Eleanor began, her voice steady, "I was a young girl from the wrong side of the tracks who fell in love with a married man. That man was Richard Whitmore Sr., the founder of this company. When I became pregnant, his wife offered me a choice: give up my baby and be set for life, or keep her and face ruin." The reporters scribbled frantically as Eleanor continued. "I was 16, scared and foolish. I gave my daughter to a good family, the Martinez family. I told myself she would have a better life, but I never stopped watching over her from afar." Alexander stepped forward. 25 years later, I fell in love with a beautiful waitress named Maria Martinez. Neither of us knew the truth about her parentage. Our love was real, and from that love came our son, Leo. "You expect us to believe you didn't know she was your sister," a reporter called out. "We didn't know," Alexander said firmly. "But even now, knowing the truth, I will not deny my son. Leo is the product of love. Complicated, impossible love, but love nonetheless." Leo surprised everyone by walking up to the microphone. At 7 years old, he stood straight and tall, just like his mother had taught him. "My mom used to tell me that family is about love, not just blood," he said clearly. She was right. "These people," he gestured to the Whitmores behind him, "they're my family, all of them, and we're not ashamed anymore." In the back of the room, Victoria's smug smile faded as she watched the reporters respond to Leo's words with tears and nods of understanding. This wasn't the scandal she'd hoped for. It was becoming a story of redemption. James Martinez, who had been watching from the side, stepped forward unexpectedly. "I need to say something," he said, his voice shaking. "Maria, she knew. Near the end, she found her adoption papers. She knew Eleanor was her birth mother, knew Alexander was her brother, but she chose to take that secret to her grave to protect her son." A gasp went through the room. Eleanor's hands flew to her mouth. "She knew. She left me a letter," James continued. "She wrote that she didn't blame anyone. She said love comes in many forms, and sometimes the heart chooses paths the world doesn't understand. She wanted Leo to know his whole family, even if the truth was complicated." Thomas, who had been silent until now, moved to stand beside his brother. "For years I fought against my brother out of jealousy and greed. But watching this boy, my nephew, face the truth with such courage, I'm done fighting. The company is yours, Alexander. All of it." Victoria stormed forward. "You can't just give up. This scandal should destroy them." "The only thing destroyed here," Mrs. Chen said calmly, "is your power to hurt this family with the truth. They've taken that power back." As the reporters clamored for more details, Alexander gathered his family close. Eleanor hugged Leo, finally, able to be the grandmother she'd always wanted to be. Ashley and Madison held their brother's hands, proud of his strength. Even Thomas managed a genuine smile. Back at the mansion that evening, as the media frenzy continued outside, the family gathered in the kitchen. Mrs. Chen was baking Maria's favorite cookies from her old recipe. "Mom would be happy," Leo said, helping with the cookies. "She always said the truth sets you free." She was right, Alexander agreed, just like she was right about so many things. Eleanor watched them, tears in her eyes. "I lost my daughter twice, once when I gave her up and again when she died. But through you, Leo, she lives on, and this time I won't let fear keep me from loving my family." But even as they began to heal, none of them noticed the envelope that had been slipped under the front door. Inside was one last secret, one that would test their newfound strength in ways they couldn't imagine. Because Victoria wasn't done yet, and she had saved her deadliest weapon for last. Mrs. Chen found the envelope while sweeping the front hall. Her hands trembled as she read its contents, and she immediately called Alexander at his office. "Come home now," she said urgently. "Victoria's gone too far this time." Within the hour, the family gathered in Alexander's study. The envelope lay open on his desk, its contents spread out like a roadmap of destruction. "She's claiming Leo isn't my son at all," Alexander said, his voice tight with anger. "She says she has DNA proof that Maria was seeing someone else when we were together." "That's impossible," Eleanor exclaimed. "Maria would never—" "It gets worse," Mrs. Chen interrupted, holding up another document. "Victoria's filed an emergency petition for custody of Ashley and Madison. She's claiming this environment is unstable and harmful to them." Ashley jumped up from her chair. "She can't do that. We want to stay here." "She's also threatening to reveal something about Maria's death," Thomas added, reviewing the papers. "Something she claims will prove it wasn't natural causes." Leo, who had been quietly listening, suddenly spoke up. "I remember something. The night before Mom died, she was upset about a visitor. I was supposed to be sleeping, but I heard them arguing." Everyone turned to look at him. "Did you see who it was?" Alexander asked gently. Leo shook his head. "No. But Mom kept saying, 'You can't prove anything and leave my son alone.' The next morning," his voice caught, "that's when she couldn't breathe right. That's when we had to go to the hospital." Eleanor's face went pale. "You don't think Victoria wouldn't—" Thomas started but stopped. They all knew Victoria was capable of anything. Just then, Madison ran into the study, clutching her phone. "Dad, Mum's doing a live interview on Channel 5. They turned on the TV just in time to see Victoria, perfectly dressed and tearfully dramatic, speaking to a sympathetic reporter. I tried to protect everyone," she was saying, "but when I discovered that Maria Martinez's death wasn't from natural causes, that there were high levels of an unusual substance in her system, I couldn't stay silent anymore." "Are you suggesting she was poisoned?" the reporter asked. Victoria dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "All I know is that certain members of the Whitmore family were desperate to keep their secrets, and Maria knew all of them." "Turn it off," Alexander growled, but Leo stopped him. "Wait," he said. "Look behind Mom in that picture they're showing." The TV showed a photograph of Maria at the diner where she worked. In the background, partially hidden by a plant, was Victoria herself, placing something in a cup. "When was this taken?" Thomas asked sharply. Mrs. Chen was already on her phone calling the diner. After a brief conversation, she hung up, her face grim. "The day before Maria got sick. Victoria came in, asked for Maria's section. The manager remembers because Victoria had never been there before." "She killed my mother," Leo whispered. "She killed her to keep the secret about our family." Suddenly, the mansion's security system beeped. Someone had entered the gate code. "That's impossible," Alexander said. "I changed the codes yesterday." "But I didn't change the ones for the service entrance," Mrs. Chen realized with horror. They heard the front door open, then Victoria's voice. "Leo, are you here, sweetheart? I have something to tell you about your mother." Before anyone could stop him, Leo ran out of the study. "Why did you do it?" he shouted at Victoria. "Why did you kill my mom?" Victoria's perfectly composed face cracked. For just a moment. "What are you talking about?" "We have proof," Alexander said, following Leo with the others. "The photo from the diner. The security cameras must have caught you putting something in her coffee." "How you have nothing?" Victoria sneered, but her hand clutched her designer bag tighter. "Actually," came a new voice, "they have everything." Detective Sarah Rodriguez stepped out of the shadows, followed by two uniformed officers. "Mrs. Whitmore, we've been investigating Maria Martinez's death for months. An anonymous source provided us with tissue samples that showed elevated levels of a rare toxin. The same toxin we just found in your possession when we searched your hotel room." Victoria's face went chalk white. "You can't prove anything." "Your dealer talked," Detective Rodriguez said calmly. "He told us everything, about how you asked for something untraceable, about how you needed Maria Martinez silenced before she could reveal the family secret. You don't understand. Victoria's voice rose hysterically. She was going to ruin everything. She was going to tell everyone about Eleanor's scandal, about Leo being both Alexander's son and nephew. The Whitmore name would have been destroyed. So you killed her, Leo said, his voice steady despite his tears. You killed my mother to protect your reputation. Victoria pulled something from her bag, a small gun. Everyone froze. Stay back, she shouted. I won't let you destroy what I built. Leo should have died with his mother. I'll fix that mistake right now. But before she could raise the gun, Mrs. Chen threw a vase of flowers at her head. Victoria stumbled, and Thomas tackled her from behind. The gun skittered across the floor as the police officers rushed forward. As they led Victoria away in handcuffs, she kept screaming about reputation and family names. But no one was listening anymore. Leo stood in the foyer, surrounded by his real family. Alexander, Eleanor, Ashley, Madison, Thomas, and Mrs. Chen. They had weathered every secret, every lie, every betrayal, and they had done it together. Your mother would be so proud of you, Eleanor told Leo, holding him close. She faced Victoria's threats alone to protect you. Now you'll never have to face anything alone again. But even as Victoria was driven away in a police car, even as the family held each other close, one last secret remained untold. Because in her final days, Maria had written one more letter, a letter that would change everything they thought they knew about the night she died. And that letter was about to find its way home. 1 year had passed since Victoria's arrest. The gardens of the Whitmore mansion were in full bloom, decorated with white flowers and twinkling lights. It was Leo's 8th birthday, but they were celebrating something else too, the final piece of Maria's story. Sister Margaret stood before the gathered family, holding a worn envelope. Maria gave this to me with strict instructions. It was to be opened 1 year after the truth came out, not before. Leo, taller now and dressed in a suit that matched Alexander's, reached for the letter with trembling hands. The family gathered. Close as he began to read, My dearest Leo and my beloved family, if you're reading this, then the truth has finally come to light. But there's one last truth you need to know. Alexander, my love and my brother, I discovered our true relationship 6 months before I got sick. At first I was devastated, but then I realized that our love, complicated as it was, gave me the greatest gift of all, our son. Eleanor, my mother, I want you to know I forgave you long ago. You were so young, faced with an impossible choice. I watched you from afar too, you know. Every time you came to the diner, trying to work up the courage to talk to me. But there's more you all need to know. Victoria didn't act alone the night she poisoned me. There was someone else, Richard Whitmore Sr., Alexander and Thomas's father, Eleanor's first love. He was there. He came to warn me. He tried to stop Victoria, to tell me what she was planning. But he had a heart attack right there in my apartment. His last words were a confession. He had arranged everything. The fake documents that kept Alexander away, the money that was supposed to buy my silence. He thought he was protecting his family's reputation. His death was what Victoria used to blackmail the family lawyer into helping her. I didn't die just from the poison. I could have fought harder, could have gotten treatment. But I knew that as long as I was alive, Leo would never be safe from those who wanted to protect the Whitmore secrets. So I made a choice. I left all the evidence of Victoria's crime where it would eventually be found. I knew that only the truth, all of it, could finally set our family free. Leo, my brave, beautiful boy, by now you've found your place in the family that was always yours. Ashley and Madison, love him as the brother he is. Thomas, the bitterness that poisoned your heart can finally heal. And Alexander, you were my first and only love. In another life, perhaps we could have had our happy ending. But in this, one, we created something even more precious, a family that chose love over lies. Mrs. Chen, thank you for being my secret keeper all these years. And Eleanor, Mom, thank you for giving me life twice. First when you bore me, and again when you gave me the chance at a different path. I love you all. And now, finally, we can all be free. With eternal love, Maria. The garden was silent when Leo finished reading. Alexander held Eleanor as she cried. Thomas stood with his head bowed. Ashley and Madison hugged Leo from both sides. She saved us all. Mrs. Chen said softly. Even after everything, she found a way to bring healing instead of more pain. But why wait a year to tell us? Ashley asked. Because, Eleanor realized, she wanted us to become a family first, to choose each other before we knew all the truth. Alexander looked around at his family, his mother, his brother, his 3 children, the faithful Mrs. Chen. They had weathered every storm, faced every secret, and emerged stronger. I think it's time, he said quietly. They walked together to a newly installed memorial garden. A beautiful statue of Maria stood among the flowers, her face caught in that bright smile they all remembered. At its base was a simple inscription: Maria Martinez Whitmore, beloved mother, daughter, sister. Her love knew no boundaries. Leo placed Maria's final letter in a time capsule, along with the original photograph that had started everything. Alexander handed the document that officially changed Leo's name to Leo Martinez Whitmore. Eleanor contributed Maria's birth certificate, both of them, the real one and the adopted one, Ashley, and Madison added pictures of their new family. Thomas placed the keys to the company, which would now be run by all of them as a family. Mrs. Chen stepped forward with one last surprise, a recording she'd kept all these years. Maria's voice filled the garden, singing the lullaby she used to sing to Leo. As the sun set over the Whitmore mansion, the family stood together, listening to Maria's voice. They were an unusual family, born of secrets and lies but transformed by love and truth. Leo held his father's hand, surrounded by the love of 2 sisters, an uncle, a grandmother, and the devoted Mrs. Chen. "Happy birthday, Leo," Alexander said, softly. "Happy birthday, brother," Ashley and Madison echoed. Leo looked up at the statue of his mother, her smile seeming to shine in the fading light. "Thank you, Mom," he whispered, "for everything." In the distance, the city lights began to twinkle. The reporters and scandal seekers had long since moved on to other stories. Victoria awaited trial in prison. The Whitmore name had survived, not because they had buried their secrets, but because they had faced them with courage and love. And somewhere, Leo was sure, his mother was watching, finally at peace. Mrs. Chen began serving the birthday cake, Maria's recipe, of course. As the family gathered around the table, their laughter and love filled the garden. They were no longer bound by the weight of secrets or the fear of truth. They were simply family. In all its complex, beautiful, imperfect glory, the moon rose over the mansion, casting a gentle light on the statue in the memorial garden. The wind rustled through the flowers, carrying the echo of Maria's lullaby. And in that peaceful moment, the story of the boy and the stranger, who turned out to be so much more than that, came to its end. But really, it was just the beginning. Because love, as Maria had written, knows no boundaries. And the truth, once it sets you free, gives you wings to fly. The end.